The ledger lay open on the plantation desk, its pages warped and yellow by years of damp heat. But it wasn't the figures for cotton output or tobacco shipments that made the overseer's hand shake as he raised the lantern closer. It was a column he had been ordered to maintain separately, concealed from casual inspection. A column meant for something no one dared discuss openly. Yet everyone had begun to notice. The entries went back 7 years, and each one was more unsettling than the last. Blue eyes, pale blonde hair, fair skin that darkened only slightly as the children aged. All born to enslaved women spread across 3 Louisiana parishes. Different mothers every time. Children who resembled neither their mothers nor the men listed as their fathers in plantation records, nor anyone else living in the quarters. And the whispers had already begun. Whispers had drifted from plantation along the Mississippi River, carried by traders, by runaways, by house servants who overheard anxious conversations behind closed doors, by midwives who delivered these unnatural children and felt a chill run through their blood, because someone was fathering them, someone who moved without being seen, someone who left no mark except the undeniable proof written on the faces of infants who, by every rule of the world they lived in, should not exist. Before we continue with the story of Louisiana's most disturbing secret, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now, let's uncover what truly happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. The mystery would stretch across 7 years, shatter families and lives, and expose a truth so deliberate and so cruel that even seasoned plantation owners would struggle to accept it. But in 1837, when the first of these children was born, no one yet understood what they were witnessing. What began as a single anomaly would evolve into a pattern so deeply unsettling that it would shake the foundations of Louisiana's plantation society, expose the darkest reaches of a system built on human bondage, and reveal how power could be exercised without consequence when the law itself existed to shield the guilty. Louisiana in the late 1830s was a land of sharp contrasts. New Orleans flourished as one of the wealthiest cities in America, its port pouring out sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. French and Spanish colonial legacies still shaped daily life, from architecture to customs to the languages spoken in the streets. Creole French blended with English, Spanish, and African tongues, creating a linguistic world unlike anywhere else in the country. The city's theaters staged opera and ballet. Its kitchens produced food that rivaled Paris. Ballrooms glittered beneath chandeliers shipped from Europe. Yet beyond the glow of gas lamps and the elegance of city mansions, past the manicured gardens and ornate facades, the plantation economy ruled with unchecked authority. The parishes upriver from New Orleans, St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension formed the core of Louisiana's sugar country. These were not the vast cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama, where enslaved people labored in relative isolation across enormous tracts of land. Sugar demanded something different. Different labor, different timing, different cruelty. Sugar cane had to be cut and processed within a narrow window before frost ruined the crop. As a result, from October through December, the grinding season, every plantation became a factory operating without pause. Enslaved people worked shifts that stretched 18, 20, sometimes even 22 hours at a time. They cut cane under the harsh November sun, dragged it to the sugar houses, fed it into grinding mills, boiled the juice in enormous kettles, stirred the thickening syrup as it crystallized, and packed the finished sugar into hogsheads for shipment downriver. The machinery was unforgiving. Mills could seize clothing, hair, or limbs, pulling workers into crushing rollers before anyone could intervene. Boiling vat of sugar juice could splash, inflicting burns that stripped flesh down to bone. Exhaustion led to errors, and errors led to injuries and deaths that were calmly entered into account books as losses of property, calculated against the expected profits of the harvest. The death rate among enslaved people on Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest in the American South. Plantation owners knew this. They planned for it. It was cheaper to work people until they died and purchase replacements than to slow production and preserve lives. This was the world into which those strange children were born. A world where human beings were reduced production units, where their bodies belonged to others, and where the law offered no protection and no appeal. These parishes were more densely populated than most plantation regions. Estates sat close together along the river, often divided only by a thin stand of cypress trees or a narrow bayou. The Mississippi itself served as the main highway, the artery connecting everything. Steamboats traveled constantly, carrying goods, mail, passengers, and news. Information moved fast. A birth on one plantation would be known on 3 others by morning. A death, a sale, a punishment. Nothing stayed secret for long. That closeness made the mystery even more troubling. When the unusual births began, they did not occur in isolation. They formed a pattern, and patterns implied intent. The first plantation to officially record such a birth was Belmar, a mid-sized sugar operation owned by the Deschamps family. They had controlled the land for 3 generations, dating back to the Spanish colonial era. The main house was built in the Creole style, elevated on brick piers to guard against flooding, with wide galleries wrapping around both levels. Ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss lined the drive from the river road. Behind the house sprawled the sugar works, the mill, the boiling house, the curing sheds, and the cooperage where barrels were fashioned. Farther back, screened by trees, stood the quarters. 2 rows of cabins faced each other across a dirt lane. Each structure held multiple families, sometimes 10 or 12 people crowded into a single room. There was no privacy, no comfort, no space, only endurance. The Deschamps household consisted of Monsieur Philippe Deschamps, his wife Celeste, and their 3 children. Philippe was 48 years old in 1837. He was a thin, tightly wound man who had inherited the plantation from his father and managed it in a constant state of unease. He worried endlessly about crop yields, about fluctuating sugar prices, about competition from Cuban imports, about the loans he had taken to expand his operations. He worried about slave uprisings, about abolitionists, about the shifting political climate that threatened the entire system on which his wealth depended. His overseer, Victor Habert, was 32 years old and had worked at Belmar for 6 years. Habert was unusual for an overseer. He could read and write fluently in both French and English. His records were precise and exhaustive. He had a reputation for being strict but not gratuitously cruel, for extracting productivity through structure and organization rather than outright terror. That made him valuable to Deschamps, who lacked a stomach for the level of violence many plantation owners believed was necessary to maintain control. Habert lived in a small house position between the main residence and the quarters, deliberately placed so he could observe both. He rose before dawn every morning, made his rounds, assigned work details, monitored progress, and recorded everything meticulously in his ledgers. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name. He knew their skills, their limitations, their family ties. That knowledge was power, and Habert used it carefully. It was Habert who first noticed the anomaly in March of 1837, and it was Habert who would spend the next 7 years trying to understand what it meant. The child was born just before dawn on March 14, 1837. She was delivered by an elderly enslaved midwife named Josephine, a woman who had helped bring more than 200 children into the world over her 6 decades. Josephine had been born in Saint-Domingue before the Revolution, before it became Haiti. She had been taken to Louisiana as a young woman and had survived everything that followed. The transfer from French to American rule, multiple changes in ownership, the deaths of her own children, the relentless, crushing labor of sugar harvest year after year. She had seen every possible complication childbirth could bring. Breech births, stillbirths, mothers who bled to death on cabin floors, infants born too early to survive, twins tangled together, infections that turned into fever and then into death. Over time, She had learned to keep her face blank, to show nothing, to simply do her work and move on to the next crisis. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and saw her features in the dim lamplight, she felt something she rarely experienced anymore. Genuine fear. The mother was a woman named Marie, dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She had been born on Belmar and had never known any other life. Her own mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12 years old. Caught in the grinding mill, her screams abruptly cut off as the machinery pulled her in. Marie had witnessed it. She had been standing less than 10 feet away, frozen, unable to move, unable to help, powerless to do anything but watch. After that day, Marie grew quiet. She spoke only when required, kept her eyes lowered, did her work without complaint. When she was 18, she had been paired with a man named Thomas, a match arranged by Haber for the purpose of producing children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong, dependable, 25 years old. They shared a corner of a cabin already crowded with 3 other families. Marie had already given birth once, a boy named Jacob who was now 4. He looked like both his parents, dark skin, dark eyes, tightly coiled hair. He was healthy and alert, already being prepared for labor in the fields. The second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every observation of inheritance, every understanding of how children resemble their parents pointed in one direction. The baby should have been dark-skinned, dark-eyed, dark-haired. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and lifted the infant toward the lantern, she saw pale skin, hair so light it was nearly white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her thoughts racing. She had heard stories, passed down from older midwives over generations. Stories of children born looking different from their parents, explained by distant ancestry, by bloodlines carrying hidden traits. The elders spoke of African peoples who had mixed long ago with Arab traders, with Portuguese sailors, with countless others who had crossed the continent over centuries. Sometimes, they said, those old mixtures resurfaced, producing a lighter child. But this was not that. This was not a slightly lighter complexion or a looser curl. This child looked as though she had been born to a family from Northern Europe, not to Marie. Her features were unmistakably European. The narrow nose, the thin lips, the bone structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she said nothing. She stared. Her exhaustion gave way to something else, recognition perhaps, or resignation. Her hands trembled as she took the baby, and Josephine watched tears slide down her face. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked softly, a question that carried far more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. Marie did not answer. Her silence was response enough. She held her daughter close, rocking gently, and Josephine saw a grief so deep it seemed to fill the small cabin. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming in from the fields where he had been working the night shift during grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his expression draining of all emotion. "That's not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours," Marie whispered. "She is." Thomas stepped closer. "Look at her," he said. "Look at her and tell me that's my child. Marie, tell me, who is it?" His voice was rising now, sharp and dangerous. "Who did you?" "No one," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, no one. I don't understand this. I don't understand." Josephine stepped between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, even though she didn't believe her own words. Old blood coming through, ancestors from long ago. Thomas stared at the baby, then at Marie, then at Josephine. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cabin. By midday, everyone on Belmar knew about the birth. The news spread to the quarters like wildfire. People came to see for themselves, crowding into the cabin to stare at the impossible child. Some whispered about curses, about spirits, about punishment from God. Others said nothing at all, their expressions dark and unsettled, as though they understood something they could not or would not put into words. By evening, the news had reached 2 neighboring plantations, carried by enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, by traders who stopped at multiple landings along the river, by the invisible web of communication that ran beneath the surface of plantation society. By the end of the week, Victor Habert was summoned to the main house to explain the situation to Monsieur Deschamps. Habert walked up the oak-lined drive with a knot of dread in his stomach. He had already questioned Marie, first gently, then with increasing pressure. She had insisted she had been with no one but Thomas. She had sworn it through tears, even as she clutched her strange-looking daughter. He had questioned Thomas, who refused to accept the child as his, who had moved out of the cabin and requested reassignment to a different work crew. Habert had questioned others who shared the cabin, anyone who might have seen or heard something. No one offered any useful information, or if they had it, they were not willing to share it. Deschamps was pacing his study when Habert arrived, his narrow face tight with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. A portrait of Deschamps' father hung above the fireplace, his gaze stern and disapproving. "Sit down, Habert," Deschamps said. "Tell me exactly what happened." Habert took the chair opposite the desk and laid out the facts as he understood them. The birth, the child's appearance, Marie's insistence that she had been with no one but Thomas, the complete absence of evidence or testimony suggesting otherwise. "It's not possible," Deschamps said, resuming his pacing. "Thomas is a father. It's in the records. I have the breeding ledger right here." He pulled a book from the shelf and flipped through the pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born in 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," Habert replied carefully. "That's what the records indicate." "Then what is the problem?" Deschamps snapped. "I don't care what the child looks like. There must be an explanation. Mixed ancestry, perhaps some distant bloodline. These things happen." "Sir," Habert said quietly, "I've seen cases of mixed ancestry. This is different. This child appears entirely European." Deschamps stopped pacing and stared at him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Habert said. "I'm only reporting what I've observed. Because if you're implying that someone, one of us..." Deschamps broke off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. The implication was too dangerous, too explosive. "I'm not implying anything," Habert repeated. "I'm asking how you want this handled." Deschamps lowered himself heavily into his chair, suddenly looking older, more worn down. "Record the birth," he said at last. "Note the unusual appearance. But the father of record remains Thomas. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "And Habert," Deschamps added, "this is not be discussed. Not with other overseers. Not with anyone. It's a private matter. An anomaly. Nothing more." "Yes, sir." Habert left the main house with his thoughts in turmoil. He understood Deschamps' position. The idea that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would have been scandalous, but not unheard of. Such things happened, even if they were rarely acknowledged. The real danger lay elsewhere. Marie insisted she had been with no one but Thomas. That meant that if the child was not Thomas's, then something had been done to her without her consent. And if that were true, it raised questions about security, about control, about the rigid order that was supposed to govern plantation life. It suggested that someone could access the quarters, could reach enslaved women, without oversight and without consequence. That night, Habert returned to his small house and opened his personal journal, separate from the official plantation ledgers. He wrote down everything he knew about the birth, Marie's testimony, the child's appearance. He dated the entry carefully, March 14th, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this would be the first of many such entries, that he was recording the beginning of something that would consume the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie could neither explain nor escape. Thomas never acknowledged Claire as his daughter. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. The enslaved community at Belmar was divided in its response. Some felt deep sympathy for Marie, sensing that something terrible had been done to her, even if she could not or would not speak of it. Others were suspicious, convinced she must have been with someone, must have brought this fate upon herself. A few were openly afraid, sensing that Claire's existence meant something dangerous, something that threatened everyone. Claire grew. She was healthy, meeting every normal milestone, but her appearance became more striking with time. Her hair thickened and lightened into a vivid blonde. Her eyes remained a piercing blue. Her skin stayed pale, burning easily beneath the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a child from Northern Europe somehow transplanted into the quarters of Louisiana sugar plantation. The contrast was impossible to ignore. It was unsettling. It was wrong. Then, 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second child was born on a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Belmar. Riverside was larger, with more land under cultivation and a greater enslaved population. Its owner was Etienne Broussard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter whose family fortune had been built on sugar. Broussard was known for running a profitable operation. He was also known for his temper, for his readiness to use violence to maintain control, for his belief that enslaved people had to be kept in a constant state of fear to remain productive. His overseer, a man named Gideon Frost, shared this philosophy fully. Frost was 40 years old, a transplant from Virginia, who had come to Louisiana in search of opportunity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face roughened by years of sun and wind. A whip hung coiled at his belt, and he had no hesitation about using it. The enslaved people at Riverside feared him deeply, and Frost believed fear was a cornerstone of effective management. The mother was a young woman named Deline, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a laundress. She had been chosen for that position because of her quiet nature, her efficiency, and her ability to make herself invisible. House servants had to master that skill, the ability to be present without being noticed, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear conversations without appearing to listen. Deline had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district and sold to Riverside when she was 15. The sale had torn her away from her mother and 2 younger siblings. She never saw them again. That loss hollowed something inside her, leaving an emptiness she filled with work, with routine, with whatever small comfort she could grasp. A moment of rest, a full meal, a day without pain. She had been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 22 years old, strong and quiet. They lived together in the quarters, sharing space in a crowded cabin. Their relationship was civil but distant. They were 2 people bound together by someone else's decision, doing what they could with lives neither had chosen. When Deline realized she was pregnant, her emotions tangled together. There was fear, because pregnancy meant vulnerability, pain, the possibility of death. But there was also a fragile hope. A child would be someone to love, someone who belonged to her, even if only briefly before the plantation claimed that child as well. The pregnancy progressed without complication. Deline continued her work in the laundry, hauling heavy buckets of water, scrubbing clothing raw, hanging it to dry in the heavy, humid air. As her belly grew, the labor became harder, but she never complained. Complaints led to punishment. She gave birth in May of 1838, attended by the plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth. The labor was long and exhausting, stretching through the night and into the following day. Finally, the baby arrived, a boy, healthy, crying loudly. Ruth cleaned the infant and then stopped. Her hands froze. The color drained from her face. "What is it?" Deline asked weakly, reaching for her son. "What's wrong?" Ruth didn't answer. She handed the baby to Deline and stepped back, her expression tight with unease. Deline looked down and felt the world tilt beneath her. The child had blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale it almost seemed translucent. He looked nothing like her. Nothing like Samuel. Nothing like anyone in her family. "No," she whispered. "No, this can't." "Who is the father?" Ruth asked quietly. "Samuel," Deline said at once. "Samuel is the father. I haven't been with anyone else. I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Deline said as tears spilled down her face. "I can't explain it." Samuel was brought in from the fields to see the baby. His reaction was immediate and sharp. He stared at the child, then at Deline, his face hardening. "You've been with someone," he said coldly. "I haven't, Samuel. I swear." "Don't lie to me. Look at him. That's not my child." "He is," Deline insisted. "He has to be. I haven't been with anyone else." "Then who?" Samuel demanded. "Who did this?" "I don't know," Deline sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel walked out of the cabin and did not return. He requested reassignment to a different work crew and a different cabin. He never acknowledged the boy as a son. Gideon Frost learned of the birth within hours. He stormed into the quarters, pushed into the cabin where Deline lay recovering, and stared down at the child with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Who's the father?" he demanded. "Samuel," Deline whispered. "That's not Samuel's child." Frost snapped. "Look at it. I haven't been with anyone else." "You're lying." "I'm not," Deline said desperately. "I swear on my life." Frost questioned her for over an hour, his voice growing harsher, his threats more explicit, but Deline's story never changed. She had been with no one but Samuel. She could not explain the child's appearance. She did not understand what had happened. Eventually, Frost gave up and reported the situation to Etienne Broussard. Broussard reacted with rage. He accused Frost of failing to maintain proper control, of allowing enslaved people too much freedom, of neglecting his duties. Frost defended himself fiercely, insisting his operation was tight, that no outsider could have entered the quarters without being seen. The argument went in circles until Broussard made a final decision. The birth would be recorded. Samuel would be listed as a father of record, despite the obvious impossibility. The matter was to be closed, not discussed, forgotten. The boy was named Jean, and like Claire before him, he was a living contradiction, a child who should not exist. When word of Jean's birth reached Belmar, Victor Habert felt a cold certainty settle deep in his chest. This was not coincidence. It was not random variation. It was something else. Something intentional. Something happening across multiple plantations. He pulled out his personal journal and made a new entry, carefully noting the date of Jean's birth, the plantation where it occurred, the mother's name, and the circumstances. He placed it beside his notes about Claire and studied the two entries, searching for links. Both mothers had worked in or near the main houses of their plantations. Maria had been temporarily brought in from the fields to help clean during a period when Belmar's house staff was shorthanded. Deline already worked in the house, but in the month before her pregnancy she had been assigned additional duties: night work, cleaning rooms, preparing the house after the family had retired for the evening. Habert felt his pulse quicken. This was a pattern, a connection. It might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. He began asking questions cautiously, quietly. He spoke with traders who traveled between plantations, posing casual inquiries about births, about strange occurrences, about rumors they might have heard. He questioned enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, listening carefully, never revealing what he already suspected. Properties, listening closely to their conversations, noting small details, and then he waited, because if his suspicions were correct, if this was a pattern rather than coincidence, then it would happen again. He was right. Over the next 2 years, 3 more children were born with the same impossible features. Each birth followed the same disturbing pattern. An enslaved mother with dark skin and features, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either parent. The third child was born at a plantation called Oak Ridge in November of 1838. The mother was a woman named Isabel, 25 years old, who worked in the main house as an assistant to the cook. The baby was a girl with pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Isabel insisted she had been with no one but her assigned partner, a man named Gabriel. No one believed her, but no one could prove otherwise. The fourth child was born at a plantation known as St. Clair in March of 1839. The mother was a woman named Therese, 19 years old, who had been brought up from the quarters to help serve at a formal dinner 2 months before her pregnancy began. The baby was a boy with the same unmistakable features. Therese's partner, a man named Antoine, refused to acknowledge the child. The fifth child was born at Magnolia Grove in September of 1839. The mother was a woman named Pauline, 22 years old, who worked in a laundry. She had been called into the main house to assist with cleaning during a period when the regular staff was overwhelmed. Her baby was a girl, blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Her partner, a man named Louis, left her shortly after birth. Victor Habert documented each case in his private journal. He recorded the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, and their work assignments. He drew a crude map, marking each location where a birth had occurred. The plantations were spread across 3 parishes, yet all lay within a 15-mile stretch along the Mississippi River. And then he noticed something else. Something that took months to fully emerge from the noise of details. A name that appeared again and again in the background of each case. Never central, never obvious, but always present. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a physician, 42 years old, unmarried, and widely respected throughout the parishes. He had been born in Louisiana to a French father and a Creole mother. At 18, he had been sent to Paris to study medicine, spending 8 years there before returning to Louisiana in 1825 to establish his practice. He was known for his skill, particularly in treating fevers and infections common in the humid climate. He was also known for his discretion, his ability to handle delicate matters without gossip, to keep secrets. That reputation made him popular among planter families who valued privacy above nearly everything else. Levine served multiple plantations as their primary physician, traveling between them as needed. He treated planters and their families, and he treated enslaved people when their value justified the expense. A skilled laborer with a broken bone, a pregnant woman whose child represented future property, a house servant whose training made them difficult to replace. These were worth the cost of medical care. He was also known for his appearance, tall and slender, with pale blonde hair worn longer than fashion dictated, and striking blue eyes that seemed to look straight through people. He dressed well but without excess, favoring dark suits that emphasized his light coloring. He moved with deliberate precision, spoke softly, never raised his voice, and always appeared in complete control. Habert had encountered Levine several times over the years. The doctor had been called to Belmar to treat Madame Deschamps for a fever, to set the broken arm of a field hand injured during harvest, to attend to various minor illnesses. Habert had found him competent, professional, and strangely cold. There was something about Levine that made him uneasy, though he had never been able to articulate why. Now, reviewing his notes, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Levine had been present at or near each plantation during the critical period before each pregnancy began. He had attended a social gathering at Belmar in December of 1836, 3 months before Marie conceived. He had been called to Riverside to treat Madame Broussard for a respiratory illness in February of 1838, 3 months before Deline conceived. He had delivered a child for the planter's wife at Oak Ridge in August of 1838, 3 months before Isabel conceived. He had examined an injured worker at St. Clair in December of 1838, 3 months before Therese conceived. He had attended a dinner party at Magnolia Grove in June of 1839, 3 months before Pauline conceived. Always there, always nearby, always with access. Habert's hands trembled as he traced the connections. He reviewed his notes again and again, checking dates, cross-referencing visits, searching for errors in his reasoning. But the pattern held. It was too exact to dismiss. Still, suspicion was not proof. Haber had no witnesses, no confession, no direct evidence. Only a chain of coincidences, so precise they defied chance. He needed to speak with the women. If Levine was responsible, they would know. They might not speak openly. They might not dare accuse a white man, let alone a respected physician. But they would know. Haber began with Marie, since she lived on his plantation. He found her one afternoon in the fields, working a hoe, her daughter Claire strapped to her back in a cloth sling. Claire was now 2 years old, her blonde hair shining brightly in the sun. "Marie," Haber said quietly as he approached, "I need to speak with you." Marie looked up, her expression instantly guarded. "Yes, sir." "About Claire," he said. "About her father." Marie's face closed completely. "Thomas is her father, sir. That's what the records say." "Marie," Habert said gently, "I know that isn't true, and I think you know it too." "I don't know what you mean, sir." "I think someone hurt you," Habert continued. "Someone you couldn't refuse. Someone who held power over you." Marie was silent for a long time. Then she spoke very softly. "Even if that were true, sir, what difference would it make? I'm property. Property can't be hurt. Property can't refuse. Property has no rights." She paused and added, "I have nothing more to say, sir. Thomas is Claire's father. That's what the records show." She turned back to her work, and Habert knew he would get nothing further from her. The barrier she had built around that truth was absolute. He tried with the others. On various pretexts, he traveled to the neighboring plantations, finding moments to speak privately with Deline, with Isabel, with Therese, with Pauline. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Each woman insisted she had been with no one but the man listed in the records. Each said she had nothing more to add. The same invisible wall stood between them and the truth, unyielding every time. Haber understood why. These women had no legal standing, no rights, no protection. If they accused a white man, especially a respected physician, they would not be believed. They would be punished for lying, for causing trouble, for threatening the social order. Their children could be sold away. Their lives could become even more unbearable than they already were. Silence, however inadequate, was the only shield they had. Habert decided he needed to take his findings to someone with real authority, someone who might be able to act. He chose Judge Armand Thibault, a respected figure in St. James Parish. Thibault was 60 years old, a lawyer who had been appointed to the bench 15 years earlier. He was known for a degree of fairness within the limits of the system, for his willingness to confront difficult matters, for his intelligence and personal integrity. Habert requested a meeting, and Thibault agreed. They met in the judge's office at the parish courthouse on a humid afternoon in July of 1840. Law books lined the walls, and papers covered nearly every surface. Thibault sat behind his desk, a large man with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes. Habert presented his evidence carefully. He showed the judge his map, with the plantations marked along the river. He laid out his timeline, matching the dates of the births with the dates of Dr. Levine's visits. He explained the pattern, the repetition, the improbability of coincidence. Thibault listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as Habert spoke. When Habert finished, the judge leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a long moment. "This is a grave accusation," Thibault said at last. "I know, sir," Habert replied. "That's why I brought it to you." "Do you have any direct evidence?" Thibault asked. "Any testimony from the women?" "No, sir. They won't speak or can't. I've tried." Thibault rose and went to the window, looking down at the street below. The courthouse sat at the center of the parish seat, a small town serving the surrounding plantations. Wagons rolled past. Horses were tied along the road. People moved through the heat, going about their ordinary lives. "You understand what you're implying," Thibault said, his back still turned. "Dr. Levine is a respected member of this community. His family has been here for generations. His father was a prominent merchant. His mother came from one of the old Creole families. To accuse him of something like this without undeniable proof would be ruinous. It would destroy his reputation, his practice, his life. I understand, sir, Habert said, but the children exist. The pattern exists. 5 children in 2 years, all with the same impossible features, all born to women who had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Patterns can be coincidence. 5 times, sir, across 5 plantations, all within 2 years, all tied to one man. Thibault turned back to face him. Even if you're right, he said slowly, even if Dr. Levine is responsible, what law has he broken? You've said yourself the women won't testify. Without their testimony, there is no case. He hesitated, and even with it, Habert understood what the judge left unsaid. Even if the women spoke, enslaved women had no legal standing. Their word would never outweigh that of a white man, particularly one held in such esteem. The law did not recognize what had been done to them as a crime. So there's nothing to be done? Habert asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. I didn't say that, Thibault replied. I'll make discreet inquiries. I'll speak with some of the plantation owners, ask questions, see what I can learn. But I want you to stop your investigation. If this spreads, if accusations begin without proof, it could cause panic and damage we may not be able to control. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Return to Belmar. Say nothing to anyone. Let me handle this. Habert left the courthouse with a mix of relief and frustration. He had done all he could. The matter was now in official hands. Still, he could not shake the feeling that nothing would come of it, that the truth would be buried beneath reputation and social standing. He was right. Judge Thibault did make inquiries, but they were so discreet they were nearly invisible. He spoke privately with 3 plantation owners in carefully arranged meetings that left no public record. He asked vague questions about Dr. Levine's visits, about unusual events, about the births of the distinctive-looking children. The responses were uniformly defensive. The plantation owners viewed the questions as threats to their property values, their reputations, their standing in society. They insisted there was nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. The children were anomalies, genetic quirks, nothing more. Etienne Broussard of Riverside was particularly hostile. He received Thibault in his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Are you suggesting I don't know what happens on my own property? Broussard demanded, his face flushed with anger. That I can't control my own people? This is insulting, Armand. Deeply insulting. I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Thibault replied calmly. I'm simply following up on concerns brought to my attention. Concerns? Broussard snapped. That some babies were born with light skin? That happens. Mixed ancestry. Distant bloodlines. It's not unusual. 5 babies in 2 years, Etienne. All on different plantations. All with the same features. So it's coincidence. Nothing more. And all the mothers had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Broussard's expression hardened. Face drained from flushed red to an unhealthy pale. What are you implying? He demanded. I'm not implying anything, Thibault replied evenly. I'm stating facts. Dr. Levine is a respected physician, Broussard snapped. He's treated my family for years. He is above reproach. I'm sure he is, Thibault said, but the pattern... There is no pattern, Broussard cut in sharply. There are coincidences, and I will not have you spreading rumors that could damage a good man's reputation, or mine. Do you understand? Thibault understood. He understood that Broussard was far more concerned with scandal than with truth, more worried about property values and social standing than about justice. He understood that pushing further would only make enemies of powerful men, weaken his own position, and ultimately accomplish nothing. The other plantation owners responded in much the same way, defensive, hostile, unwilling to even consider that something deeply wrong might have occurred on their land. To acknowledge that possibility would have meant admitting a failure of control, a failure of oversight, a failure of the system itself. Within 2 weeks, Tebow sent word to Habert that the matter was closed. There was insufficient evidence to proceed. The investigation was to be dropped. Habert received the news with bitter resignation. He had expected it, yet the finality still cut deep. He filed his notes away, locked them in his desk, and tried to return to his regular duties. But the births did not stop. In November of 1840, another child was born at a plantation called Sweetwater, 8 miles south of Belmar. Sweetwater was smaller than most, specializing in indigo rather than sugar. The owner was a widow, Madame Hebert, no relation of Vincent, who managed the operation with the help of her adult son. The mother was a woman named Cecile, 24 years old, who worked in the sugar house during grinding season and in the fields the rest of the year. The baby was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Cecile's partner, a man named Joseph, refused to acknowledge the child. Dr. Levine had been called to Sweetwater 3 months earlier to treat Madame Hebert's son for a fever. He had stayed for 2 days, sleeping in a guest room and taking his meals with the family. In March of 1841, another birth occurred at Riverside. This time the mother was a different woman, a field hand named Lisette, 21 years old. The baby was a girl with the same unmistakable features. Lisette's partner, a man named Michel, left her after the birth. Dr. Levine had attended a social gathering at Riverside in December of 1840. In August of 1841, another child was born at Oak Ridge. The mother was a woman named Marguerite, 23 years old, who worked in the main house. The baby was a boy. Marguerite's partner, a man named Henri, refused to speak to her afterward. Dr. Levine had been called to Oak Ridge in May of 1841 to treat an injured field hand. In January of 1842, yet another birth took place at a new plantation called Cypress Point, 10 miles north of Belmar. The mother was a woman named Adele, 20 years old. The baby was a girl. Adele's partner, a man named Francois, requested transfer to a different plantation. Dr. Levine had attended a dinner party at Cypress Point in October of 1841. The pattern continued, relentless, undeniable. Vincent Habert documented every birth in his private journal. Even after being ordered to stop his investigation, he could not let it go. The pattern was too precise, too intentional. There were 9 children now, all with the same impossible features, all linked to Dr. Levine. With each new birth, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved community knew something was terribly wrong. They could not speak openly. They could not accuse. They could not demand justice. But they understood, and they began to protect themselves in the only ways available to them. Women started refusing assignments to the main houses. They claimed illness, injury, exhaustion, any excuse to avoid being called up from quarters. When pressed, they became sullen, resistant, uncooperative. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with punishment. Women were whipped for refusing work assignments, for feigning illness, for insubordination. Still, the resistance continued. The women seemed willing to endure punishment rather than risk being summoned to the main houses again. This created serious problems for plantation operations. House servants were essential. Laundry had to be done. Meals had to be cooked. Rooms had to be cleaned. When women refused these duties, the burden fell on others, breeding resentment and disorder. Tension spread across the plantations. Productivity declined. Small acts of rebellion increased. Tools broken, work slowed, minor sabotage that could never be traced to a single person but accumulated into real disruption. Plantation owners blamed their overseers for losing control. Overseers blamed the enslaved workers for laziness and defiance. No one wanted to confront the true cause of the unrest, except Vincent Habert. He saw it clearly. He understood the fear driving the resistance. The women were protecting themselves in the only way they could, through refusal and quiet defiance. even at the cost of pain. And then Habert made a decision that would change everything. He continued documenting the births, but this time he did not keep the information to himself. He shared it carefully, selectively, with other overseers, with traders, with anyone he believed might listen. He made copies of his map, his timelines, his notes linking Dr. Levine to each incident. He knew how dangerous this was. He knew he was risking his position, perhaps even his life. But he could no longer remain silent. The pattern was too clear, the injustice too vast, the suffering too deep. At first, the information spread slowly, then faster. Overseers spoke among themselves, comparing observations, sharing stories. Traders carried the knowledge from plantation to plantation, from parish to parish. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became discussions. By the summer of 1842, the story was known throughout all three parishes. It was discussed in hushed tones in plantation offices, in guarded letters exchanged between planters, in carefully chosen words spoken by people who knew they were approaching something explosive. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public knowledge. And finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. Levine's response was not what anyone expected. He did not deny the accusations. He did not flee. He did not show any sign of shame or fear. Instead, he called a meeting in September of 1842. Formal invitations were sent to the owners of every plantation involved, requesting their presence at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibault, several other prominent citizens of the parish, and, most unexpectedly, Vincent Habert himself. The letters were courteous but unmistakably firm. Levine wrote that he was aware questions had arisen regarding certain matters, and that he wished to address those questions directly and thoroughly. He requested the courtesy of being heard before any further action was taken. The plantation owners were taken by surprise. The invitation alone was unusual, nearly unprecedented. Still, curiosity outweighed caution, and they agreed to attend, eager to see what Levine might say and how he intended to defend himself. Habert received his own invitation with a heavy sense of dread. He did not know what Levine was planning, but he was certain it would not end well. The meeting took place on Thursday evening, September 15th, 1842. The air was heavy with humidity, the sky threatening rain. 15 men gathered at Levine's home, a modest yet well-appointed house on the edge of the parish seat. Unlike the Creole-style plantation homes common in the region, Levine's house was built in the American style, with a symmetrical facade and a central hallway. Levine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, exchanging polite conversation, playing the part of a gracious and composed host. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes steady and untroubled. There was no sign of nervousness, no hint of concern. Once all the guests had arrived, Levine led them into his parlor. Comfortable chairs were arranged in a semicircle. A sideboard held decanters of whiskey and brandy, glasses and cigars. Levine invited the men to help themselves, to relax, to make themselves at home. The atmosphere was deeply unsettling. It felt like a social gathering rather than a confrontation. The men sat in strained silence, waiting. Levine stood before them, calm and composed. He held a glass of brandy, took a small sip, and then began to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but perfectly clear, "I understand that questions have arisen regarding certain births that have occurred over the past several years. Questions about the appearance of these children, about their parentage, and about my possible involvement." The room went completely still. Every eye was fixed on him. "I wish to address these questions directly and honestly," Levine continued. "I believe clarity is preferable to rumor, and truth preferable to speculation. So let me be unambiguous. Yes, I am the father of these children. All of them." The silence exploded into chaos. Men shouted. Chairs scraped across the floor. Several stood at once, demanding explanations. Judge Tebow called for order, his voice nearly lost in the uproar. H.M. Broussard was on his feet, his face flushed deep purple with rage. Deschamps looked as though he might collapse where he sat. Levine waited, patient, unmoved. He sipped his brandy while the room slowly settled. It took several long minutes before enough calm returned for him to be heard again. "I understand your shock," Levine said evenly. "But before you judge me, I ask that you listen to my explanation. What I have done with purpose, and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning," Broussard shouted. "You violated—" "I have conducted an experiment," Levine interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting cleanly through the noise. "A scientific experiment, one I believe carries profound implications for our understanding of human heredity and racial characteristics." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. Confused, horrified, Levine crossed the room to a desk in the corner and retrieved a leather-bound journal. He held it up so all could see. "For the past 7 years," he said, "I have studied the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I sought to determine whether the physical characteristics associated with race are immutable or whether they may be altered through selective breeding." He opened the journal, revealing pages filled with meticulous notes, diagrams, measurements, and observations. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the work of a man who took pride in order and documentation. "I theorized," Levine continued, "that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce offspring displaying European traits. The children born during these years have confirmed my hypothesis. Regardless of the mother's appearance, my genetic contribution has proven dominant, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin." Vincent Habert felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar reactions. Faces drained of color, jaws clenched tight, hands gripping the arms of their chairs. The calm, clinical way Levine spoke about women, about children, about human lives was more disturbing than rage would have been. "You're speaking about human beings," Judge Tebow said, his voice trembling. "Not livestock, not experimental material. Human beings." "Am I?" Levine asked, turning toward the judge. His expression was genuinely curious, as if the question intrigued him on an intellectual level. "The law of the state says otherwise, Judge Tebow. The law states these women are property. The law states their children are property. I have violated no statute. I have broken no law. I have merely utilized available resources in the pursuit of scientific knowledge." "You've committed rape," Habert said, the word hanging in the air like poison, "repeatedly, against women who had no ability to refuse you, no ability to protect themselves." Levine turned to him, his expression unchanged. "Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Habert. These women are not legally recognized as persons. They are property. I have no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when breeding his cattle. The law is quite explicit on this point. The logic was monstrous, but it was also legally accurate. Louisiana law in 1842 did not recognize enslaved people as having the legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be violated in that way. The law protected owners from theft or damage to their property, but it did not protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, but none spoke up to challenge Levine's reasoning, because to do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social structure that sustained their way of life. If enslaved people were acknowledged as persons with rights, then the entire institution of slavery would collapse. "Why?" Deschamps asked at last, his voice barely audible. "Why do this? What do you hope to gain?" "Knowledge," Levine replied without hesitation. "Understanding. I sought to demonstrate that racial characteristics are not fixed, that they can be altered through selective breeding. This has implications for everything, for slavery, for colonization, for future human civilization. He stepped back into the center of the room, his journal still in his hand. His voice took on an almost evangelical intensity. Consider the possibilities. If racial traits can be shaped through selective breeding, entire populations can be reshaped. We can create laborers perfectly suited to specific climates and forms of work. We can eliminate undesirable traits and enhance desirable ones. We can engineer the future of humanity itself. "You're insane," someone muttered. "I am a scientist," Levine corrected calmly. "And my experiment has succeeded. The children exist. The evidence is undeniable. I have proven that European traits dominate African traits in mixed offspring. This is valuable knowledge, gentlemen. Knowledge that advances our understanding of human biology, heredity, and the very concept of race." Judge Tebow stood, his face flushed with anger and something darker, disgust perhaps, or horror. "Dr. Levine," he said sharply, "regardless of legal technicalities, what you have done is morally abhorrent. You inflicted suffering on women who had no power to refuse you. You destroyed families. You destabilized multiple plantations. You have created a scandal that will stain this entire region." "I have created knowledge," Levine replied evenly. "What you choose to do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I have documented everything, my methods, my observation, my conclusions in this journal and others. It will be valuable to future scientists, to future generations. You will leave this parish," Tebow said. "You will cease your practice, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal technicalities aside, I will make your life here impossible." Levine smiled faintly, and the smile was somehow more unsettling than anything else he had said. "I have already made arrangements to depart, Judge Tebow. My work here is finished. I have collected sufficient data. I am relocating to Texas, where I intend to continue my research on a broader scale. The frontier offers opportunities unavailable in more established regions." "Get out," Broussard snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana. And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you myself." Levine set down his brandy glass and inclined his head slightly, as if accepting a courtesy. "I will be gone within the week," he said. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I felt it important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumors and speculations serve no one." The meeting dissolved into shouting, threats, and bitter arguments. But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. Levine had violated no statute. He could not be prosecuted, could not be punished through official channels. The system that should have protected the women he had violated had instead protected him. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. His house was sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His medical practice was transferred to another physician. His furniture, books, and personal belongings were packed and shipped away. He disappeared into the expanding American frontier, carrying his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty with him. The fallout from Levine's revelation spread through the parishes like an illness. Plantation owners attempted to suppress the story, but it was impossible. Too many people knew. The scandal became common knowledge, discussed in New Orleans drawing rooms, in riverboat saloons, and in carefully worded letters exchanged between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained. By the time Levine left, there were 13 of them, ranging in age from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their appearance, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. Each mother struggled differently with the child she had been forced to bear. Some, like Marie, tried to love their children despite everything. Marie held Claire close, sang to her, shielded her as best she could. Yet there was always a distance, a barrier Marie could never fully break. Every time she looked at Claire, she saw the violation, the helplessness, the night that had changed her life forever. Others could not bear it. Deline at Riverside withdrew into herself after Jean's birth. She cared for him mechanically, feeding him, cleaning him, but showed no warmth. When Jean reached for her, she turned away. When he cried, she passed him to another woman. The children sensed this rejection. Even as infants, they grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were unwanted, knowing their very existence caused pain. The men listed as fathers, the recorded partners, responded with anger and abandonment. Thomas never acknowledged Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin, avoided even looking at the child. Eventually, he requested transfer to another plantation, and Deschamps granted it, eager to remove a source of tension. Samuel at Riverside did the same. So did Gabriel, Antoine, Louis, Joseph, Michel, Henri, Francois, and the others. These men had been paired with these women by their owners, forced into relationships they had not chosen. Over time, they had built fragile lives together, finding small comfort in companionship. The births shattered those bonds. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them. Children who were constant reminders of violation and powerlessness. The enslaved community itself was divided. Some felt deep sympathy for mothers, understanding that something unspeakable had been done to them. They helped when they could, sharing food, watching children, offering quiet support. Others recoiled, afraid that proximity to these women and their children might invite punishment or suspicion. Fear, like everything else, spread. And the children grew, marked forever by the circumstances of their birth, living in a world that had no place for them. Their very existence a silent accusation against a system that refused to acknowledge their humanity. They could, watching the strange-looking children, sharing food, offering whatever comfort was possible. Others reacted with suspicion or outright hostility. They believed the mothers must have done something to deserve what had happened, must have been willing participants. They whispered about the women, spread rumors, avoided them. The children grew up surrounded by this tension and division. They were never fully accepted, yet never entirely cast out, existing in a liminal space within the quarters. As they grew older, their appearance became even more striking. By the time Claire was 5 years old, she looked like a child from Scandinavia somehow stranded on a Louisiana plantation. Her hair was long and golden, her eyes that startling blue, her skin pale and easily burned by the sun. Among the other children, she stood out like a flame in darkness. The same was true for all of Levine's children. They were considered beautiful by European standards, and that beauty made them valuable in a particular and terrible way. As they aged, some of the girls were sold to traders who specialized in what were euphemistically called fancy girls, light-skinned enslaved women sold specifically for sexual exploitation. The boys were often kept as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for roles where they would be seen by visitors. This was yet another layer of horror. Levine's experiment had not only violated the mothers, but had also created children who would themselves be exploited because of their appearance, because of the very features that marked them as different. Vincent Habit remained overseer at Belmar for 3 years after Levine's departure, but the work became increasingly unbearable. Every day he saw Claire growing older, saw Marie's quiet suffering, saw living proof of a crime that had no legal name and no possibility of justice. In 1845, Habit resigned and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a position that paid less but allowed him to sleep at night. He took his journals with him, the careful documentation of everything he had witnessed. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, Habit donated those journals to a historical society. He included a cover letter explaining what the documents contained, why it kept them, and what they represented. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime, a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show how a system designed to treat human beings as property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I preserve these records because I believe that someday someone will want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were cataloged and filed away, rarely examined, a quiet testament to crimes that had never been officially acknowledged. Judge Thibault did attempt to pursue legal action against Levine. Every attorney he consulted gave the same answer. There was no case. No law had been broken. The women had no legal standing to bring charges. The plantation owners had no grounds for complaint, since their property had not been damaged in any way the law recognized. Tebow spent months searching for any legal avenue that might allow prosecution. He combed through law books, wrote to colleagues in other states, sought counsel from legal scholars. The answer never changed. Under Louisiana law in 1842, what Levine had done was not a crime. That realization haunted Tebow for the rest of his life. He had spent his career believing the law, believing that the legal system, however flawed, ultimately served justice. Levine's case forced him to confront a harsher truth: that the law itself could be unjust, that a system built on the premise that some human beings were property could never deliver justice to those people. Tebow retired from the bench in 1850, citing health reasons. He died in 1855, and those who knew him said he was never the same after the Levine affair. As for Dr. Marcus Levine, he did relocate to Texas, where he established a new medical practice in a growing frontier town. According to fragmentary records that survived, he continued his research for at least another decade. There are hints in letters, in birth records, in the memories of people who lived in that town that the pattern continued. More children with impossible features. More women who could not speak of what had been done to them. Levine died in 1856, apparently of natural causes, at the age of 56. His executor, a lawyer who had been managing his affairs, discovered Levine's journals among his possessions. He read them, was horrified by their contents, and made a decision. He burned every journal, every note, every piece of documentation related to Levine's experiments. Some knowledge, the lawyer wrote in his own diary, was too dangerous to preserve. Some truths were too monstrous to pass on to future generations. He destroyed Levine's work not to protect Levine's reputation, but to protect humanity from the ideas contained in those pages. But the children remained. The evidence of Levine's experiments lived on in the faces of 13 children in Louisiana and an unknown number in Texas. These children grew up, had children of their own, and passed on the genes Levine had introduced into their families. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, these children, now adults, faced a different kind of struggle. They were too white-looking to be easily accepted in black communities, yet by law and heritage were barred from white society. They existed in a liminal space, belonging fully to neither world, their lives a living reminder of the violence that had created them. Some tried to pass as white, leaving their families and histories behind, creating new identities in distant places. For those with the lightest skin and most European features, this was sometimes possible. They disappeared into white society, married white spouses, raised children who never knew their true origins. Others remained within black communities, accepting their outsider status and building lives despite the suspicion and questions that followed them. They married, had children, formed families of their own. Sometimes their children resembled them, blonde, blue-eyed, pale. Other times African features reasserted themselves, producing children who looked more like their grandmothers than their parents. The genetic legacy of Levine's experiments did not end with him. It continued, quietly, relentlessly, passing from generation to generation. Even today, more than 180 years later, there are families in Louisiana who occasionally give birth to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child despite having predominantly African ancestry. Most of them do not know the full truth of their heritage. The details were buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased. Yet the story remains preserved in old ledgers, in Habbert's meticulous notes, in birth records that reveal an impossible pattern, a reminder that the horrors of slavery were not limited to physical brutality or economic exploitation alone. They also included the total dehumanization of human beings, the reduction of people to property, to experimental material, to objects that could be used and violated without consequence. Louisiana kept discovering those children, kept recording their births, kept noting the impossible pattern. 13 children in 7 years, all with blonde hair and blue eyes, all born to enslaved women with dark features, all fathered by a single man who viewed them not as human beings, but as data points in an experiment. The system that should have protected their mothers, that should have punished their father, that should have recognized the crime for what it was, failed completely. Because in Louisiana in 1842, enslaved women were not considered persons. They were property, and property could not be raped. Property could not be violated. Property could not demand justice. That was the true horror, not merely the births themselves, but the legal and social structure that made them possible, and then shielded the man responsible. The horror lay in a system that allowed a respected physician to conduct experiments on human beings without consent, to violate women who had no legal recourse, to create children who would grow up permanently marked by their origins, and then to walk away without facing any consequences. The children were evidence. But evidence of what? Evidence of a crime that had no legal name, no legal recognition, no possibility of prosecution. They were living proof that the system was functioning exactly as intended, to protect the powerful and deny humanity to the powerless. Vincent Habert understood this. In his final journal entry, written in 1867 before donating his records to the Historical Society, he wrote, "I have spent 25 years trying to understand what happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. I documented the births, traced the pattern, identified the perpetrator, and presented the evidence to those with the authority to act. And I learned that sometimes the greatest crimes are those that are perfectly legal, that sometimes the deepest injustice is built into the structure of the law itself. Dr. Levine committed no crime under Louisiana law. He violated no statute. He broke no rule. He simply used the system exactly as it was designed, treating human beings as property, as resources, as experimental subjects. The law protected him because the law was written to protect men like him. The real crime was not only what Dr. Levine did to those women, monstrous as that was. The real crime was a system that made it possible. The law that denied those women any legal standing, any rights, any recourse. The real crime was slavery itself. I kept these records because I believed that someday the truth would matter, that someday people would want to know what happened, would want to understand how such things were possible. I kept these records as a warning, as a reminder, as evidence of what happens when we deny the humanity of other human beings. The children born from Dr. Levine's experiments are now adults. They carry the mark of their origins in their faces, in their features, in the genes they will pass to their own children. They are living reminders of crime that had no name, of violation that had no legal recognition, suffering that was not legally suffering. I hope future generations will read these records and understand. I hope they will see the truth of what happened and resolve never to allow such things again. I hope they will build a society where all human beings are recognized as persons, where all people have rights, where the law protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful. That is my hope. But I am not optimistic. I have seen how easily we deny the humanity of others, how quickly we justify the unjustifiable, how readily we accept systems that benefit us at the expense of others. These records are my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what happened. May God have mercy on us all. This story reveals one of the darkest realities of American history, the complete legal vulnerability of enslaved people and the ways power could be exercised without consequence. The case of Dr. Marcus Levine and the 13 children born from his experiments shows how a system built on the premise that some human beings were property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without any legal repercussion. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe there are other stories like this, buried, erased, or forgotten in American history? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. If you found this story as disturbing and as important as I did, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who values historical truth, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into America's hidden past. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next.